Hey guys, Phantasy here. For today, we're going to be talking about the nuances of elemental weapons. You can see if they have an element on the first page where it says element and a certain icon. If it doesn't have it, it'll just be a dash, but there's multiple kinds of elements in the game and a ton of different elemental weapons. There isn't too much at the higher rarities right now, but maybe later down the line we'll see more. So I want to give information about this on how they all work. To start us off, I want to answer the question that's been asked the most, and probably the most important, is why do all these elemental weapons have way less attack power versus other weapons that don't have an element of the same rarity? So like with 8 stars, this is Neos Justitian, which at plus 70 has 804, but then other 8 stars that don't have an element have like 883, 885, 879, 859. Even the Neos Astrian, which is kind of like the same thing, has 894, but no element. Well, these elemental weapons actually have an innate multiplier to them. If they're facing enemies that don't have the elemental weakness of the element that they have, then they have a 1.1 times multiplier. If they're facing an enemy that does match the weakness, they have a 1.15 times multiplier. The way that I'll be showing this in-game is by going to different cocoons and maximizing the enemy's level so that they're all the same. So we're going to go to Engoku in the quarterstaff. We're going to go to the Malachroid in the horrible flapping cocoon. And then also the Face the Darkness cocoon with the Dark Lemnis, which is weak to light. To test this, I got a Neos J wand with nothing on it whatsoever, no upgrades. And I also have no armor equipped, just so there isn't any other factors into the mix. To actually test how the damage will stack up, we're going to be critting with our normal attacks as well as the Photonic Fury coming from those. So if there's any differences, we'll see the damage be different from, element to element or cocoon to cocoon. So first off, I went to the Malachroid cocoon, and inside I first used the light element just to see what kind of damage numbers that I would get. So for my normal, when I crit with that, I got a 158, and then the Photonic Fury from it got a 95. So then I ended up switching to the Dark Element, which this thing is weak to, and I got the same for my normal crit, but for the Photonic Fury, I got 113. So that does show that I get more damage with the Dark Element because of the elemental weakness. But it doesn't show anything yet about like extra damage from the weapon itself. So just to see if I get anything different from my other enemy, I went to the Engoku one, but I did get a 158 for my normals still, and then for any off element, if it was light, if it was fire, whatever, I got a 95 still. And then when I used the ice element, which the Engoku is weak to, I got a 113. So the exact same damage numbers across the board for both the Malachroid and the Engoku for non-element and element weakness damage. So then for the ultimate test, we're going to Lemnis, which is a light weak enemy, and just to see if we get any increase with our damage. If we do for all of our attacks, that means it does factor in the light element from the wand, the Neos J, and if it doesn't increase everything, then there's something else going on. But when we go inside with my normals, I get a 165 for a crit, which is higher than the 158 from before. So that means it does apply with the normals, so that's a good check mark there. And then for the light weak Photonic Fury, I get a 119, which that is higher than the 113. But what will happen if I put an off element into the wand? Well, the normals are still exactly the same with the 165, and then for any other element that I use for Photonic Fury, I get a 99, which is actually higher than the 95 that we saw with the other enemies. So what this means is that if you are matching the element with your weapon against an enemy, no matter what kind of attack you do, even if it's of a different element like Photonic Fury, you still get the extra damage from it, from the 10% that it has at a base to a 15% when you're matching that weakness. We can actually see this through the numbers that we just saw. So if we have a 1.15 with elemental weakness, and then non-elemental enemies, you got a 1.1 multiplier, with the elemental weapons, they should see a number like this when comparing two different instances. So with the 119 to 113 from the Photonic Fury, we don't get quite that number, but that's because of rounding. It's a little bit off because the game rounds to the highest number, and in this instance, it's a little bit bigger of a variation. But if we got bigger and bigger numbers, like with the normal attacks, 165 to 158, then you see it get pretty close. And then I did test it with my gear on, my armor, and you also see a similar number there in comparison to this. So it basically is like a flat bonus that goes to all of your attacks, and basically you always want to match that weakness when you're using an elemental weapon. This, however, also says that you don't get like an extra elemental multiplier with an elemental weapon, because the way that the game calculates this, you get a 1.2 times multiplier when you match an elemental weakness, and we don't see an additional something like that in these scenarios. Where you do see the 1.2 times multiplier, though, is when you compare the photonic furies of the same fight with the matching weakness and the non-matching weakness. So the 119 from Lemnis with light, and then the 99 with not light, you get like that 1.2 times multiplier, or the 20%. This can also be seen with the other fights, with the 113 Photonic Fury when matching the weakness, and then 95 when not matching the weakness. It doesn't get quite as close, but that's also another rounding error, pretty much. So if I did like 113 divided by 94, you'll see it be closer, but not also quite there. It's kind of like in the middle kind of situation. But it's basically the same thing, and it isn't anything like the elemental damage increase that we saw from before. And you can see them both stack with each other when you compare a Photonic Fury with the Lemnis, with its light weakness, and then with an enemy that doesn't have a light weakness that also is not matching the multiplier. You can see that it's 1.25, or like that 25%. To put this all together, what this means for elemental weapons is that you only get this kind of increase if you do not have some sort of naturally occurring elemental attack, like Photonic Furies or techniques. You only get something like this. If you match a technique with the elemental weakness of an enemy, you do get that multiplier. And if you have the element and the technique matching, you get both of them at the same time in the same attack. And what's interesting about this is if an enemy has multiple weaknesses, like a Rappy, for instance, is weak to all elements, as long as you match in any way, shape, or form, you still get both bonuses. So if you have an elemental weapon, that's going to be a guaranteed match. And if you do a technique that's different from the elemental weapon or the same, you will still get both bonuses. To prove this in game, we can face something that is weak to multiple elements, like this training target here. So if I use a light element weapon with a light Photonic Fury and switch it to some other element, then I shouldn't see any difference in the crit damage numbers with the same attack. When we do this, we are actually proven correct, because we get a 685 with the normal attack and a 493 with the Photonic Furies. So right now, this information might not be useful besides against Rappies here, but maybe in the future there'll be enemies that have 2 weaknesses, 3, or maybe interchanging weaknesses that might make things matter more. For other weird scenarios you might come across with these elemental weapons, if for some reason you're using a technique that doesn't match the enemy's weakness, but the weapon that you're using does, you still get the 15% potency instead of the 10% hidden bonus from elemental weapons, but you do not get the 1.2 times multiplier that you would get if you were matching the weakness. So because of that, you are getting extra damage, but it would still be best if you match the technique to the weakness, as you would get more damage that way than if you didn't do otherwise. The only times that I would see this come up naturally is in combat zones, which have many kinds of enemies with multiple kinds of elemental weaknesses. So like Deck Space has the ice weakness, as well as the light weakness. So you might have a Neos J, which is hitting against that light weakness, but you might be using an ice technique to hit some of the other ice enemies there at the same time. So you'll be getting the extra potency on the light ones, but you'll be getting that elemental multiplier on the ice ones. Another question that's been asked from others is, does this elemental weapon stuff work with Encore Jump or other kind of attacks like it? Well, I tested it out with the cocoons from before, and it actually does indeed work. You see more damage from the Lemnis, matching the weakness with the Neos J, and less when you face the other bosses. For the final thing today that is pretty important is, do elemental weapons cause elemental downs faster? Well, with every single attack within the game, it has down accumulation for physical and elemental attacks, no matter what it is. So like for a step attack on sword or a basic attack, whatever, it has this physical accumulation, which applies for physical downs, and then elemental accumulation for elemental downs. Normally, without an elemental weapon, you can't do any element down accumulation. This pretty much gets ignored by the game. You only do the physical portion of it. But if you have an elemental weapon, you start doing this as long as you match the elemental weakness on the enemy. So a weapon that typically only does physical downs before can now do both downs as long as you accumulate up to a certain amount that it needs to cause the down. But does this apply to already element attacks? Yes and no. With techniques, they have elements built into them. So Bowie has fire, Barta has ice, and so on and so forth down the list. And each of them have their own element accumulation that triggers if you match the technique to the enemy's weakness. But if you have a light weak, with Lemnis and have the Neos J, you still do not get this element accumulation because their innate element takes priority over the elemental weapon. With techniques that do match your weapon, though, like Grants or Gigarants to Neos J, you'll get the full amount of the elements here because you are still matching with the technique, but you won't get anything extra for also matching the weapon, at least in terms of down accumulation. You'll still get the 1.15 multiplier over the 1.1 for damage, but nothing in terms of this here. There are cases, though, that when you're using elemental attacks, it does kind of work, like with Wand's Photonic Fury, as well as Jet Boot's elemental set. So with Wand, the way that Photonic Fury happens is if you put an element into your wand and then start doing certain attacks like PAs or basic attacks to cause the Photonic Furies to happen. So if you have an elemental weapon, with the regular attacks, you get this element down accumulation if you match the weakness to the enemy. And then for the Photonic Fury, if you match that to the element of the enemy, then you also get that. But if your weapon is the only thing that's matching and not the Photonic Fury itself, you'll only get the element from the regular attack and not the Photonic Fury. The way that this works, unlike the techniques, is that these are considered two separate attacks. You can see it in game because you get two different damage numbers. So because these are separated, that's why you get extra benefit in terms of down accumulation for this. The Jet Boots are the same exact way with its element set, where the element set is an extra attack on top of your Photon Arts. So the Photon Arts will get the extra element down, but then the element set just functions just like a technique where it has to match with its innate element. So as long as there's at least part of the attack is just normal, or just the full attack on the rest of the weapons is just normal innately, then you'll get this extra elemental down to cause more elemental downs. And this is just really good for bouncers and tectors in particular, because with bouncers you have that elemental decline, so that will just increase that even more for the elemental down accumulation. And then for tector, this is great for weak element amplifier, which allows you to get your photon blast gauge faster, because basically every attack you're doing is part of that elemental weakness against an enemy. Definitely a lot of things to consider when going for a elemental weapon. Right now, it isn't too relevant because we're on 9 and 10 stars right now, and currently there's none in that range. The latest was the Neos Justitian series that we tested throughout the video, and that was an 8 star. Like, there's still some relevancy in terms of using it for, like, Dark Falls enemies, like Aegis or Solus, but other than that, elemental weapons currently aren't used. So, pretty much just keep this information in the vaults, just in case in later rarities or when we get to the actual end game with, like, 14 and 15 stars, they become more relevant or a thing to keep in mind. But let me know if you guys have any other questions about this stuff in the comments down below. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.